When you walk into a modern survival store today, the message is immediate. Safety has a price tag. Walls full of gear, military-grade gadgets, multi-tools with 30 functions, all whispering the same lie in your ear. Buy this, then you're ready. But here's the uncomfortable question. If all this is truly indispensable, how did humans survive tens of thousands of years without shops, without batteries, without spare parts, without manuals? They didn't survive because they had more products. They survived because they mastered principles, judgment, skills, and systems that keep working when everything else fails. And in the next few minutes, I'll show you exactly the mindset that history used to overcome ice ages, hunger, war, shipwrecks, and total collapse. Hit subscribe now because this story, exactly this story, could bring back your belief in miracles. Part 1. The lie of the modern age of survival. Walking into a modern survival store today, the message is immediate and overwhelming. Walls full of gear promise security, multi-tools with 30 functions, tactical gadgets stamped with words like extreme, elite, military grade. Everything seems designed to save your life. Yet history tells a much quieter story, and it tells it very clearly. For more than 99% of human existence, there were no specialty stores, no batteries, no spare parts, no instruction manuals. And yet, people survived ice ages, famines, wars, shipwrecks, failed expeditions, and total supply chain collapse. So here's the uncomfortable question we rarely ask. If all this modern equipment is truly essential, how did humanity survive tens of thousands of years without it? The answer isn't that people were lucky. The answer is that survival used to be built on principles, not products. History shows us something deeply unsettling to the modern mind. Survival was never about having more tools. It was about having the right ones. Simple tools, repairable tools, tools that worked across generations, climates, and catastrophes. What modern survival gear often sells is the feeling of preparedness. What history built was actual resilience. This video isn't about rejecting modern technology, it's about exposing the illusion that gear alone can replace judgment, skill, and proven systems. Because when collapse is real, history, not marketing, is the only teacher that has never failed. Part 2. The deadly confusion of comfort and survival. One of the biggest mistakes modern survival culture makes is confusing convenience with capability. Comfort feels safe. Convenience feels efficient, but neither guarantees survival. Historically, survival decisions were brutally simple. Tools were judged on one question only. Do they continue to work when everything else fails? In Roman military records from the 1st century, equipment was chosen not for innovation, but for repairability. A broken tool that could be fixed in the field was more valuable than a superior one that failed once. The same logic is found centuries later with Arctic explorers, frontier settlers in North America, and even World War II infantry units operating behind enemy lines. Survival was never optimized for convenience. It was optimized for endurance. A tool that saves 5 minutes today but fails tomorrow is a liability. A tool that costs energy to use but repeatedly saves lives is an asset. History forces us to recognize a harsh truth. In real survival conditions, the enemy isn't discomfort. The enemy is wasted energy, broken systems, and dependence on things that cannot be renewed. When people died in the past, they rarely died because they lacked innovation. They died because they lacked water, warmth, orientation, or the ability to maintain what they already had. This understanding changes everything, because once you stop chasing comfort, you start building survival that actually lasts. And that brings us to the first tool history never gave up on. Part 3. The knife is not a weapon. It is a mobile workshop. In almost every archaeological find on Earth, one object appears again and again, not as a symbol of violence, but as a symbol of survival: the knife. From Paleolithic flint blades over 40,000 years old, to Viking sea axes, to the simple carbon steel knives carried by 19th century frontier settlers. The knife remained central for one reason: it created more than it destroyed. Historically, a knife was not judged by how sharp it was right out of the package. It was judged by how long it could remain useful. A good blade processed food, shaped wood, repaired gear, cut ropes, scraped hides, and even helped create other tools. In many cultures, the knife was maintained daily. Blades were sharpened on river stones. Handles were rewrapped. Blades were reused for decades, sometimes generations. Compare this to many modern survival knives, designed more to impress than to endure. Complex coatings, brittle alloys, oversized profiles that are difficult to sharpen in the field. History favored the opposite. Simple steel, predictable behavior, easy restoration. Here lies a lesson that modern survival culture often ignores. A tool that can be infinitely renewed outlasts a tool that works perfectly once. In survival conditions, sharpness is temporary. Maintainability is permanent. When you understand this, the knife ceases to be a weapon and becomes something much more powerful. It becomes a factory you carry with you, a system that transforms the harsh environment into shelter, warmth, and food. And history trusted it, not because it looked impressive, but because it never stopped working. Part 4. Fire was never about warmth. It was about control. As early as 400,000 years ago, archaeological findings from sites like Beech's Pit in England provide evidence of consistent human use of controlled fire, not as a luxury, but for dominance over the environment. Fire made water potable. It made food digestible. It hardened wooden tools. It signaled allies and warned enemies. In terms of survival, fire reduced risks. Cold nights became bearable. Waterborne parasites were neutralized. Raw calories were transformed into usable energy. History doesn't teach us that fire-starting tools were advanced, but that they were reliable. Flint and steel, friction methods, and later ferro rods all shared the same advantage. They had no moving parts. They withstood abuse. They could be used wet, cold, and damaged. But there's a deeper lesson most people overlook. Historical survivors didn't rely on a single method to make fire. They relied on knowledge. Roman soldiers were trained to make fire in the rain. Indigenous Arctic cultures preserved embers during winter migrations. Early explorers documented carrying multiple ignition methods, not as emergency gear, but as proof that skill was more important than equipment. In true survival, redundancy isn't owning more devices. Redundancy is knowing how to solve the same problem with fewer resources. Fire wasn't about comfort. It was about controlling the unknown. Part 5. Containers outlasted weapons for good reason. Weapons dominate our imagination of survival, yet archaeology tells a different story. At excavation sites across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, cooking vessels consistently show longer lifespans than weapons. Clay pots were repaired. Metal kettles were reshaped. Containers were kept long after blades were discarded. The reason is simple and deadly serious. Dehydration and malnutrition kill faster than predators. Without a container, water remains dangerous. Without a container, food cannot be safely cooked or stored. A simple metal vessel allowed for cooking, purification, transport, and reuse. It transformed rivers into sources of life and raw ingredients into sustenance. During the Lewis and Clark expedition in the early 1800s, journals frequently refer to kettles and containers as mission-critical items, not rifles, not ammunition. Containers. This tells us something uncomfortable about modern survival priorities. A tool that cannot carry water cannot carry life. History trusted containers because they multiplied every other survival system. Fire became useful. Foraging became efficient. Travel became possible. In survival, the most dangerous enemy is not violence. It is thirst. Part 6. Cordage was the silent architect of survival. Cordage rarely features in survival fantasies, but it shows up everywhere in survival history. Shelters stand because something ties them. Loads move because something secures them. Traps work because something holds tension. Repairs last because something binds them together. From sinew bindings used by Paleolithic hunters to plant fibers twisted by indigenous cultures to ropes found in Roman military camps, cordage silently enabled survival without ever drawing attention to itself. Modern survival culture is often obsessed with carrying large amounts of paracord. History did something far more effective. It taught people how to make cordage. This difference matters. A person who carries cordage will eventually run out. A person who understands fibers never will. Frontier accounts from North America describe settlers twisting cordage from bark, grasses, and animal hair as routinely as sharpening blades. Cordage wasn't a product, it was a process. The real lesson here isn't about materials, it's about adaptability. Survival favors those who can transform the environment into infrastructure. And cordage, more than almost any other tool, made that transformation possible. It held shelters together. It held lives together. And history never stopped trusting it. Part 7. Heavy tools saved energy, and energy saved lives at first glance. Axes and hatchets seem to contradict survival logic. They are heavy. They take up space. They require strength. And yet, history never let them go. From Viking settlements in Scandinavia to frontier cabins in 19th century North America, axes consistently appear in survival accounts for a simple reason. They saved energy. A knife can cut wood, but an axe processes wood. Firewood, beams for shelters, defensive stakes, cleared paths. Tasks that would take hours with a blade could be done in minutes with an axe. In survival, this is more important than comfort. It is more important than elegance. Energy is survival currency. Historical accounts from military engineers and frontier settlers repeatedly emphasize the same principle. Tools that reduce work preserve calories. Preserved calories extend endurance, and endurance determines who survives. That's why axes were carried even when weight was important. Not because they were versatile, but because they were efficient. A heavy tool that saves thousands of calories is not a burden. It is an investment. Modern survival culture often focuses on minimal weight. History focused on minimal exhaustion, and that difference determined who survived the winter. Part 8. Needle and thread prevented death long before weapons won battles, but needles saved lives. This may sound surprising, but historical survival accounts repeatedly mention sewing tools in contexts where survival was at stake. Soldiers on forced marches, explorers trapped by weather, civilians enduring long winters. Clothing failure meant exposure. Exposure meant illness. Illness meant death. Before antibiotics, before modern medicine, prevention was everything. A torn coat let in cold air. A damaged boot led to frostbite. A ripped seam caused infections. And none of this was dramatic enough to feel dangerous until it was irreversible. Needles, thread, and basic repair skills allowed people to maintain their protective layers. They extended the lifespan of clothing. They delayed injuries. They prevented emergencies from arising in the first place. History teaches us something profoundly practical here. Survival isn't about heroic responses. It's about quiet preservation. Modern survival kits often ignore sewing tools because they seem unspectacular. History did not, because survivors understood that maintenance was the first line of defense. The strongest survivors were not the most aggressive. They were the most careful. Part 9. Light served safety, not brightness. Before electricity, darkness was dangerous. Historical societies understood this perfectly. Candles, oil lamps, and simple lanterns appear in civilizations not as luxuries, but as safety tools. Light extended productive hours, but more importantly, it reduced errors. In survival conditions, errors accumulate. A slip while cutting, a fall near fire, a misstep on uneven terrain. Darkness turned small mistakes into serious injuries. And injuries in survival contexts are rarely isolated events. Historical light sources were not powerful. They were stable. They were predictable. They lasted long enough to work, repair, eat, and plan without haste. 18th and 19th century expedition journals frequently describe the importance of steady light in camps, not for comfort, but for order. Light preserved routine. Routine preserved morale, and morale preserved judgment. Modern survival culture often prioritizes brightness and range. History prioritized reliability because, in survival, clear seeing is more valuable than far seeing. And light, when used wisely, kept people alive long before it impressed anyone. Part 10. Orientation killed more people than hunger ever did, long before hunger set in. People died simply because they got lost. History proves this repeatedly. Roman legions avoided unknown terrain, not out of fear, but because disorientation destroyed supply lines. 19th century polar expeditions failed not just due to cold, but due to navigational errors that exacerbated every other risk. Even experienced woodsmen knew that moving quickly without knowing where you are turned survival into disappearance. Simple navigation tools were important because they anchored decision-making. A simple compass, a hand-drawn map, memorized and verified landmarks. These tools slowed people down, and that was the point. Survivors didn't rush. They moved deliberately. Orientation determines everything else. Where to find water, where to build shelter, when to stop. Knowing your position preserved energy and prevented panic, and panic was historically as deadly as exposure. Modern reliance on GPS has subtly reversed this logic. Speed is rewarded, direction is assumed. But history teaches a harder rule. When technology fails, orientation becomes the backbone of survival. Those who knew where they were survived longer than those who moved faster. Part 11. Small hand tools built everything that kept people alive. Survival is rarely dramatic. It is constructive. Archaeological finds repeatedly show small hand tools in survival contexts. Awls, chisels, small pry tools, punches, and wedges. These were not glamorous. They did not look impressive, but they enabled the quiet work that sustained life. Shelters were shaped, not crudely cobbled together. Containers were repaired, not discarded. Weapons were maintained. Structures were improved incrementally. These tools transformed raw materials into usable systems. Military engineering manuals from antiquity emphasized the same principle. Victory depended less on combat than on logistics, fortification, and repair. Hand tools made improvisation possible. When standardized equipment failed, modern survival kits often replaced these tools with novelties. History made the opposite choice. It trusted tools that multiplied human capability rather than replacing it. Survival favors builders over gatherers. Those who could shape their environment survived longer than those who merely carried gear. Part 12. Simple medical tools prevented small wounds from becoming graves in historical survival practice. Death rarely came suddenly. It came quietly. A cut that became infected. A wound that bled for too long. A blister that led to immobility. Before antibiotics, these were not inconveniences. They were deadly trajectories. For this reason, basic medical tools repeatedly appear in survival records. Bandages, tourniquets, needles, clean cloth. Early intervention was more important than advanced treatment. Napoleonic field surgeons observed that soldiers who received immediate wound care had significantly higher survival rates than those treated later. Frontier diaries reflect the same lesson. Clean wounds early and you live. Ignore them, and the outcome is predictable. The historical insight is not about advanced medicine. It's about timing. Survival depends on stopping problems before they grow. The earlier an injury is stabilized, the less energy it drains. The less it drains, the longer survival remains possible. Modern survival culture often focuses on catastrophic scenarios. History focused on preventing small failures from compounding, because in real survival, it is rarely the dramatic event that kills you. It is the unheeded detail. Part 13. Skills always outlasted supplies. History is brutally consistent on one point. Supplies run out. Skills do not. Across civilizations, survival training focused less on hoarding supplies and more on transmission. Knowledge was passed on because it could not be confiscated, destroyed, or exhausted. A person who knew how to make fire, shape tools, repair clothing, and read terrain carried survival within them. When Roman legions were cut off from their supply lines, survival depended on improvisation, not resupply. When frontier families lost access to trade routes, they adapted with techniques already learned. Even shipwreck survivors who endured months on isolated coasts did so not by hoarding equipment, but by reconstructing systems from memory. Modern survival culture often emphasizes quantity. More gear, more backups, more redundancy. History emphasized capability. One skill replaced dozens of items. The difference is profound. A warehouse can burn down. A skill travels with you. Survival isn't about how much you carry. It's about how much you understand. And history trusted people who invested in learning rather than accumulation. Part 14. Why modern survival gear fails when collapse is real. Modern survival gear is impressive. It's innovative. And under controlled conditions, it often performs exactly as advertised. But a collapse is not controlled. History shows us why many modern systems fail under real pressure. Batteries die, electronics break, proprietary parts fail without replacement. Tools designed for optimization fail when abused beyond their design limits. In contrast, historical tools anticipated failure. They were designed to be dropped, soaked, frozen, poorly repaired, and still function. They relied on physics, not firmware. Steel, friction, gravity, and human judgment. This is not a rejection of modern technology. It is a warning against dependency. When systems collapse, simplicity scales up. Complexity collapses inward. The more specialized a tool becomes, the more fragile its survival role often is. History trusted tools that could survive neglect, ignorance, and damage, because in a real crisis, perfect use is rare. The most dangerous survival failure is assuming technology will behave as expected when everything else does not. Part 15. History has already tested these tools. You haven't. History is the longest survival experiment ever conducted. It spanned ice ages, empires, plagues, migrations, and wars. The tools that passed this test were not the most advanced. They were the most reliable. They did not depend on infrastructure. They did not assume ideal conditions. They worked when people were tired, injured, scared, and mistaken. What connects all 15 principles in this video is not nostalgia. It is evidence. Durability beat innovation. Maintenance beat replacement. Skill beat accumulation. And energy efficiency beat comfort. The lesson for the modern world is not to abandon technology, but to question it honestly, to ask if a tool makes you more resilient or merely more dependent, because survival is not about buying more gear. It's about becoming harder to eliminate. History has already proven what works. The question is, are we ready to listen? If you value lessons tested by centuries instead of trends tested by marketing, you're already thinking like a survivor, and history welcomes you.